Dear Mrs. President Metsola, dear Professor Ruffert, dear Mr. Dama, dear students, guests, and friends of Europe, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Humboldt University, I warmly welcome you to this year's Humboldt Lecture on Europe. It is a great pleasure to greet you as our guest here, Ms. President, in this beautiful hall in the building of our graduate school, as well as remote via live stream to this special occasion. The Humboldt Lectures on Europe are among the university's most prominent events. We invite very prominent speakers, political leaders, constitutional court judges, financial experts. We are proud that some of these speeches are seen as intellectual landmarks in the debate on the future of Europe. And we take care that we cover a broad range of perspectives, as it is our mission as a university to provide an open space for controversial but constructive debate. We want to educate our students as critical European citizens who acquire deep knowledge and engage in active debate. And thank you, Mrs. President, for reminding us in your note you just wrote in our Golden Book that we as Europeans should remember our common values, the values that tie us together. And you also wrote that we in this university know especially well how important our common values are. So thank you, Mrs. President. With the Humboldt Lecture on Europe, we address a broader audience, as it is our mission not only to engage in excellent research and educate the next generation, but also to foster the exchange between science and society. So this event is part of our broader strategy, the Open Humboldt strategy, that from time to time turns the ivory tower, if it still exists at all, into an agora, a public space where matters are discussed that are of crucial relevance for the society. Dear Mrs. President, it is an honor and a great pleasure to have you here today. In preparation for this event, you said that Europe's biggest challenges in this year are, I quote, to be competitive, to protect our values, to rethink our approach on security and defense, to deliver on migration, to reform, to stand with Ukraine and reinforce our place in the world. In these few words, you gave a very clear impression of how challenging these times are, not only, but also for the European Union. You are looking at the European Union from two perspectives. First, as an elected member of the European Parliament since 2013, representing the people of Malta. And in this regard, you bring in the perspective of the southern borders of the European Union. And your second perspective is the perspective of the President of the European Parliament since 2022. And in this role, you represent the democratic heart of the European Union. When the European Parliament celebrated the 17th anniversary of the Common Assembly of the European Coal and Steel Community, the predecessor of the European Parliament, you said about the European Parliament, I quote, "It's the only directed, elected, multilingual, multi-party, transnational parliament in the world." And you went on saying that, I quote again, "Our process is sometimes frustrating. Progress is not always fast enough or deep enough or easy enough. We must keep reforming. But I am proud of our achievements as our way of being a beacon of the defense of democracy, of the way that we've never been indifferent." End of quote. 2024 will be a crucial year for the European Union. In May, the European Parliament will be re-elected. We will see how strong democracy in Europe is, whom voters will give their vote, and what this means for the European Parliament's capability to find consensus on European legislative acts. Of course, policy making in the European Union still very much depends on the European Commission's initiative and the political will of the national governments to agree. But the decisive role of the European Parliament is often underestimated. Therefore, I'm especially delighted that with your Humboldt Lecture on Europe, we give voice to the European Parliament in this important moment. Looking at the enormous challenges we Europeans face, the acceptance of the European Union will very much depend on its capability to solve the most urgent problems. The latest Eurobarometer conveyed some slightly positive messages on European democracy, showing that compared to only 32 or 33% who trust the national government or parliament, 47% of the EU population tend to trust the EU. 37% have a neutral image of the European Union. Of course, these figures do not sound overwhelmingly positive, but they show a higher level of trust in the EU than 10 years ago. So I think there is something to build on. And I would like now to thank our sponsors and partners, the Stiftung Mercator, Wir sind Europa, and the representation of the European Commission in Germany for enabling us to hold this event. And we are very much looking forward to your perspective on the future of Europe, Mrs. President. Again, a very warm welcome.
Your Excellency, Madam President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, dear Mrs. Professor Blumenthal, dear Professor Ruffert, dear students and ladies and gentlemen, dear distinguished guests, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's Humboldt Forum on behalf of the Stiftung Mercator. The Humboldt Forum has established as a great tradition within the last years to discuss the EU's most challenging issues. The term of the current European Parliament ends next year, but the challenges facing Europe remain enormous. Be the digital green transformation, the follow-up of the Green Deal, or the support of the close partners in their fight for freedom, such as the Ukraine. Europe faces a number of complex challenges that require multi-phased solutions. Stiftung Mercator has set itself the goal of contributing to these solutions, at least in the areas which we are active. These are participation and cohesion, climate action, Europe in the world, digital society. As a private and independent foundation, we are committed to a society characterized by openness to the world, solidarity, and equal opportunities. To achieve this objective, we support and develop projects that drive forward the mitigation of climate change, address the impact of digitalization on democracy and society, strengthen Europe's ability to promote a more inclusive international order. The latter goal is part of our new updated strategy for our Europe in the World Center. We want to help Europe develop a new imagine of itself, a more inclusive imagine. However, we believe in order to promote a more inclusive goal, Europe needs to be better prepared internally and externally. Internally, meaning in the way member states work together in the framework of our EU institutions. And externally, in the way we work together with our closest partner, in the way we deal with countries that share our values and wish to join the EU. Last week, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, together with Chancellor Scholz, visited Albania, one of the candidate countries of the EU. In this context, President von der Leyen said that the EU enlargement is at the top of her priorities. Our mission is also clear on this point. We want to intensify reapproachment between the EU and potential accession countries. We want to create more spaces for dialogue between the EU and its neighborhood countries. For this reason, we fund initiatives that help to build bridges with wider Europe and thereby help establishment of new trust. Trust we need urgently in the face of attacks on our common values, whether by the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine or the crucial attacks by Hamas in Israel. We want a future in which all Europeans, from Berlin to Lisbon and from Helsinki to Tirana, can identify with the values of the EU. To achieve this and address the many other challenges, Europe needs to be reformed, relaunched and reimagined, as the title of today's event suggests. Therefore, I'm pleased that the Humboldt speeches bring together students and civil society actors with European policymakers such as President Metsola to discuss their ideas about how such a reform or a relaunch could look like. I would therefore like to thank the Walter Hallstein Stiftung, Hallstein Institute, and the Humboldt-University Berlin for working together on this goal and for organizing today's event. Special thanks, of course, goes to today's speaker, Madam President Roberta Metsola. Thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your thoughts on how you reimagine Europe. And I'm very much looking forward to your speech, and I wish everyone, both here at Humboldt-University and the online audience, an inspiring and thought-provoking discussion, which will be moderated in proven manner by Professor Ruffert. So the floor is yours. Thanks all.
Thank you so much for those introductory words. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. When I heard the words that I have said quoted back at me, my first thought was how much life has changed. I had a speech prepared for this event that I rewrote a few times and then rewrote again. And I wanted to do that because the global geopolitical situation and Europe's role within it has become far more complicated than it was even 2 weeks ago. In my first speech as European Parliament President, I quoted Winston Churchill to promise that our institution would never be neutral between the fire and the fire truck. And that is true so often. It seems as if there is new fire erupting that risks everything we have worked to achieve in terms of global stability. I want Europe to keep fighting those fires. I want Europe to have the tools we need for that role that will help bring the world a little bit closer to how it ought to be. I'm convinced I know Europe can be the answer, but I also know that we must do more to convince you, a younger, more skeptical audience, of the true value of Europe to not only shape our lives, but those of generations to come. And I find that talking plainly helps. So allow me to be direct. We are at an inflection point, a decision point that will determine the path we are to take. There are no easy solutions. There are often decisions that offer only bad and worse outcomes. But they are decisions that we must take and that we will keep taking. That's when you must remember to keep your head even when all around you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, or when you hear the truth you've spoken twisted by knaves. That is the responsibility that comes with election to public office, and it is one that we all carry. We are here today under the darkest of shadows cast by Hamas's brutal terrorist attacks against Israel, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the situation in Armenia and Azerbaijan worrying the region, a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, Iran playing with fire all over the Middle East as they try to impose a hardline theocracy on their young women who are bravely rising up, and the Middle East thrown into instability. This without talking about the rise of China or India growing into a new powerhouse, Africa that we talk too often about but too rarely with, Latin America that is critical, a transatlantic partnership that has a historical, unbreakable bond, but one which is in need of renewed impetus. All of this just from a foreign affairs perspective. We are facing also huge challenges at home, with people finding it harder to pay their bills at the end of the month, with our liberal democracies under threat, with the need to create new jobs, address climate challenges and boost sustainable economic growth, questions on how we are to level up our societies, how we tackle intergenerational societal issues and ensure equality of opportunity. That is what Europe must be about. That is what Europe has done in the past and what Europe must do again. Allow me a moment to focus on the attack in Israel and the situation in Gaza and the wider region. The reality on the ground is horrific, it is tragic and desperate. I saw it myself just over a week ago in Israel, when I visited the sites of the atrocities and met with grieving survivors. When there, I expressed Europe's solidarity, I urged for the release of hostages, and reiterated our rejection of terrorism. I underlined that how Israel responds matters. How Hamas is stopped matters, and that we must work together to mitigate the humanitarian consequences to innocent people in Gaza. It is entirely correct to stand with a nation that has suffered the worst attack on its civilian population since the Holocaust, and I am proud that we did. Too many Jewish communities in Europe feel lost, scared, and threatened. Synagogues feel targeted. Mothers worry about sending their children to school. That is not the Europe we want to see. Europe stands against hate. We stand against terrorism. It is absolutely condemnable. Full stop. No excuses or justifications will ever convince me that babies, children, women, and men should be massacred, raped, mutilated, and kidnapped mercilessly. And we should say so. As author Frank Herbert put it, atrocity has no excuses, no mitigating arguments. Atrocity never balances or rectifies the past. Atrocity merely arms the future for more atrocity. It is also entirely correct to voice our concerns and desperation at the unfolding crisis in Gaza that has seen too many innocent lives lost, too many children orphaned, too many mothers cry. Standing strongly against terror and doing everything possible to alleviate the humanitarian crisis are not mutually exclusive. That is why we insist on respect for international law, why we do everything we can to protect innocent lives, why we push for the release of hostages, why we emphasize that Hamas must be stopped. We recognize that Hamas are a terrorist organization. They do not represent the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. They hinder them. That is why the Parliament also called for a humanitarian pause last week to ensure that aid gets through to people in need. And I am proud that we have done so. Europe also stands ready and willing to engage in the longer term. We know a thing or two about overcoming seemingly insurmountable issues. There is no better place than Berlin to reiterate that. We will always push for sustainable and lasting peace, for a fair two-state solution that is equitable and just. The sad reality is that the vile actions of Hamas terrorists have pushed this prospect years, perhaps even decades back. With every day 200 hostages remain in Hamas captivity, we are a day further away from lasting stability. And as a union, we have a responsibility to remain coherent and united in ensuring that such acts are not excused. To do this is not to condone more death and violence, but to provide a sliver of potential for peace to be found. Hamas does not offer hope for peace. They offer bloodshed, and too much blood has been spilled. Europe has always been on the side of humanity. That is our role, and we have to meet this moment. I belong to the generation who was sitting on our parents' lap as the Berlin Wall came down, who watched Tiananmen Square on small, grainy TV screens, who remembers the collapse of the USSR and the unbridled joy of millions of Europeans finally free to determine their own destinies, who reaped all the benefits of the victory of liberal democracy in a new world. But along the way, maybe we did grow a little bit too complacent, a little bit too comfortable, that this life, our way of life, was here to stay. Last year, we understood in the most brutal of ways just how painfully true that was, when Russia launched an illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified military invasion into Ukraine. I would like to believe that we have drawn on the lessons from our mistakes, that in this crucial moment of relaunching, reforming, and reimagining Europe, the values of peace, justice, freedom, and human dignity would remain firmly positioned at the bedrock of everything we have built and everything that we will continue to do. That is what distinguishes us as Europeans. The geopolitical sands are shifting. We have Putin's tanks on independent and sovereign Ukraine, Lukashenko in Belarus persecuting, imprisoning, torturing people for their democratic beliefs. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, where do we fit in all of this. The world cannot thrive on imbalances. We must reinforce our role in the world by being more strong and more united on the global stage. And to do this, we need to work on building up global democratic alliances of trusted partners and friends. That entails a continued commitment to stand firmly alongside Ukraine. With the situation in the Middle East dominating the headlines, Putin is expecting our political, humanitarian, and military support to waver. We cannot allow fatigue, that's exactly what he wants, to set in. And this remains as much about Ukraine's security as it is about ours. We need to reinforce our relationship with like-minded partners, with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, on security, on digital, on climate, on trade. With India, as its economy continues to grow to keep up with the aspirations of its youth. With democracies in Latin America to secure global supply chains and that can give the critical materials that the world needs. We have to talk with, as I said earlier, and not at nations in Africa, not only about migration, but about the investments that we can undertake to support and encourage their prosperity. At the same time, we also need to look at China. The de-risking versus decoupling strategy is a good one. And we must use this moment to see where we are being undercut and find ways to address those gaps. Because we in Europe do things differently. That is why we are legislating on a European Green Deal, where we have adopted a revised emissions trading system, a new carbon border adjustment mechanism, complemented by a revised renewable energy directive and a social climate fund. And as we look into diversifying who we work and do business with, what remains crucial is that we resist the temptation of moving from one unreliable partner to another. This leads me to my next topic, reform. The past few years have been difficult for Europe and for the world. We are living, if you will, in an era of so-called polycrises. Now, to be clear, I am proud of how we have been able to react and deliver. We overcame a financial crisis, a pandemic, we have gone through Brexit and found new ways forward. We have stood up for our values and stood firm against geopolitical threats. All this while future-proofing our economies, addressing climate change, and pioneering digital laws that the rest of the world will inevitably follow. The European Union has met these challenges head-on, and instead of dividing us, they united us. Instead of weakening us, they strengthened us. And our reaction has shaped us and has laid the foundations for years to come. But we also have to be honest with ourselves about the limitations of our current structures. From my conversations with Europeans across our continent, from my discussions with young people like you, I have come to understand that there remains a big gap between what people expect and what the European Union is able to deliver at the moment. If we are to grow, if we are to remain a force to be reckoned with, if we are not to stagnate, we cannot be afraid to lead the debate for change, to reform and adapt in this ever-changing and increasingly geopolitical world. That implies readying the ground for enlargement. I have heard and acknowledged many of the concerns about enlargement. They are very similar to the ones that were raised prior to 2004. Yet history has showed us that an enlarged European Union that is based on clear objectives, criteria, and merit continues to serve as an investment in peace, security, stability, and prosperity on the European continent. It is a process with an outcome that benefits everyone involved. The European Parliament has understood this, which is why we were the first institution to call for Ukraine and Moldova to receive EU candidate status last year. This has given these nations a clear European perspective and is serving as a powerful impetus for advancing democratic reforms. The same is true for the Western Balkans. At the same time, these countries are reforming and they are getting ready. So we also need to be getting ready ourselves to do the same. Because what works for a union of 27 will not work for a union of 30, of 33, or 35. And we cannot at that moment be found wanting. If we find ourselves in a situation where we leave everyone pending, then we should not be surprised if the vacuum we leave behind is filled by someone else. Security, defense, and migration should be high on our reform agenda. Work must start immediately to build a real security and defense union, one that complements NATO without competing with it. Member states must continue with efforts to increase defense spending, because if we want to ensure the longevity of our project and the security of our way of life, we simply need the resources to back it up. And the current geopolitical climate is proof of that. On migration, I am happy to say that after a decade of deadlock, we are now at a point where we can start to chart a way forward. On the table, there is a holistic legal framework that is fair with those in need of protection, that is firm with those who are not eligible, and that is harsh with those who profit of the most vulnerable. A proper common European migration and asylum system that will deliver on citizens' expectations. Now, I understand and I agree that more work needs to be done. There are many loopholes in the current framework, also in the one that is on the table. I'll give you one example. Between a negative asylum decision and the return decision. This came to light even more clearly a few days ago in the heart of Brussels. But we are closer than ever. So let me assure you of the European Parliament's unwavering commitment to finalize this legislative package by the end of our mandate. Now, when I started, I reflected on the values that bind us together as Europeans and what would be required of us in our current state of affairs. We must refrain from reducing these values to mere abstract notions and ideals. And my point here being is that to forge a genuinely equitable and fair path forward, much more effort needs to be made to transform these values into concrete benefits for people, whether that is in the green transition or in the digital transition, for example. Our job must be to ensure that our policies are ambitious enough to address the challenges we are facing, while also providing real incentives and safety nets for industry, and crucially, remaining human-centric. What do I mean by this? Meaning that they must work for people if they are, one, to succeed, and two, to be understood. Now, with the European elections coming in 2024, June next year, 6th to the 9th, this is more important than ever. And my fear is that if we get this wrong, if we ignore when people are telling us that they are worried, we will see a re-rise of the extremes. It is a balance that I know we can find. one that I am confident will rekindle citizens' hope in the potential of our project. So my final appeal to you today is to join me in this critical moment of reimagining and reforming our Europe, to reject the easy temptation of cynicism that takes over so quickly. Have your say on how you want our Europe to look like, and this is not just next year in European polling booths, which is important, but also today. Let's start our discussions everywhere on transforming Europe. And happy to do this with you, happy to answer all your questions, and more importantly, to listen to your ideas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam President, for your insights on topical and everlasting questions of European integration. So the floor is now to the audience. I welcome your questions. I particularly welcome the questions of our Humboldt-University students. So hands up. I'm sure there are points that you would like to react on, that you would like comment or question. Please. Oh, we have a question already from we are doing also some work by social media, and we have a question from the outside world, outside this room, so to say.
Yeah, okay. So we have a question from one of the Instagram followers, which is, what can students from countries like Moldova, which are candidates for the EU integration, do to bring the EU idea to their countries from Germany?
So thank you very much for this question. My immediate answer would be not to underestimate the transformative effect on a country, and especially its younger generations, of a European perspective. That is why, and I referred to this in my speech, we showed no hesitation in sending the clearest of message, and we will continue to do so, that if a country looks to Europe as its home, then we need to fling our doors wide open. Every country has its own path, but that path can be amazing. Particularly with young people, we would be able to, after taking the next step, hopefully before the end of this year, when accession negotiations can start, is that markets can be opened to those countries. Our educational opportunities can be open. Our research opportunities can be open. I know that from my country. And in the decade that it took between becoming a candidate country and a full member country, what an amazing process that was. Because the reforms that those countries have to go through also benefit Europe and their younger generations. There was a hand.
Other questions? Yes, please. The gentleman with the grey cloth.
Madam President, first of all, thank you so much for being here and being open to questions. When you were speaking about potential members or potential states for accession, I noticed there was one country that was, to me, conspicuously absent, and that was Turkey. And I was wondering what your stance on enlargement of the European Union towards Turkey or the state of the negotiation is. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this. So, in fact, the candidacy of this country was already in 1972. Talks are specifically, let's say, on that regard, not on the table. An agreement was made in 2015, you will recall, in the context of migration. There is still a call on the table for visa facilitation. In other words, for persons from that country to be able to travel visa-free. From an economic perspective, there is a strong partnership, and we look forward, especially after the most recent elections, for a renewed relationship. There is an outstanding issue, you will know and recall, is with the occupation of Cyprus, northern Cyprus. And that remains on the table and will be until that occupation is no more. And we can have a country which is Cyprus that lives as a bicommunal, bizonal federation under the auspices of the UN. That is the political background and the context within which we discuss a lot with that country, and one that is our partner. And one that we will also look forward to continuing to also be very strong presence in NATO, especially as we wait for Sweden to join. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's another question in the back of the room. Yes.
There is a question on the live stream that goes in quite a similar direction than the first question, which is how can we close the political gap between cities and more like rural areas, and how is it possible to convince people of a strong European idea? Thank you.
You know, whenever I travel to a capital city such as today, there is always one question which says, why are you always in a capital city? And that is very true, because whether we are from this country or myself as representing the European Parliament, we have members elected that say not enough attention is paid to rural areas, smaller towns and villages, because Europe is also there. Europe is in every corner of Europe and of every country. And if we have seen, let's look at the French elections last year, specific elections here. Let's look at, so I'll give a specific reference to, Romania. I'll refer to specific countries. There is a plea for Europe not only to be about young people in urban areas, so that we protect individuals that are in rural areas, whether they work, let's say, in agriculture, whether they don't have the same digital rights, whether they don't have the same access to health services, education services. That is still a very, very big problem in terms of the gaps that we see between urban areas and rural areas in Europe. And the result is those young people there either don't vote or they tend to express frustration by voting for the extremes. Or, I mentioned Romania specifically, that if, because there was a decision last year or a non-decision for Romania and Bulgaria to accede to the Schengen area, that has led to a direct rise in Euroscepticism among the young people, especially in rural areas. So we have a responsibility here, and I'm talking as myself as president. I see Hildegard Bentele, who's my colleague on the front row here, that we need to, in everything we do and wherever we talk and wherever we go, is that we don't only focus, I like to say, but not here, but usually there are flags behind me, you know. You don't only take pictures with flags behind you, but also really speak to people for whom Europe is sometimes too far away, because every decision we take affects each and every one of them.
Thank you very much. I have to rise. Yes, please, there's a question here.
Thank you very much for your speech. I was just wondering, because it was notably absent in the speech, what sort of institutional reforms you deem necessary, both regarding your own institution and the other institutions, to implement that vision that you have just laid out.
I've spoken for about 1 hour, it's true, if I also introduced into
You even have a suggestion on the table from your constitutional
Absolutely.
committee. Yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for that question. the Parliament has always been very eager to look at institutional reforms and not be afraid of discussing them. If I can be quite blunt, other institutions are not so eager and not so enthusiastic. I find myself sometimes around a European Council meeting, like I will do once again this Thursday, in 3 days from now, where I will once again put this on the table, and at most I will have 1 or 2 prime ministers responding, 2 or 3 more nodding, complete silence from the rest. That's the reality, but one that we will not give up on. Why? Because as you say, if we're going to talk about enlargement, then we need to talk about, at the minimum, an increase in numbers of members of the European Parliament. We will increase official languages of the European Union, and that means that all our translation and interpretation of all our legislation will need to be factored in. It will need a complete revision of our flagship policies, whether it is the common agricultural policy, whether it is our common foreign and security policy, whether it is about our connectivity, our multi-annual financial framework, which already now, that I did not speak about, it's true, I will say it now, but already now we have realized is not fit for purpose. I give you an example. We adopted last week a 50 billion euro for Ukraine facility, which we cannot pay from the current budget. In other words, we need to revise this Brussels language, top up our budget in order for us to give the predictability to Ukrainians that our support is unwavering. And any of that support cannot come at the cost of cutting down on Erasmus, on Horizon, flagship projects, funding projects without which, dare I say, and I say it not only because I'm at university, but my both sisters are academics, and they themselves tell me how important it is for them to have flagship European programs that help everybody, even in these countries that are on the way to becoming members of the European Union. Other discussions that have to come, that will always come, the current balance of power between the institutions. How are decisions taken? You mentioned, Professor, when you started, about the right of the Commission to initiate legislation. The European Parliament has called for that right, and if anything, it was put on the table in 2019 at the beginning of this mandate, and we will continue to insist that it comes. But also not to underestimate the impact of legislative reports that are initiated in the European Parliament, such as ones we have started on media freedom, protection of journalists, that because of that have led to a Media Freedom Act that is currently being negotiated, a legislative instrument on strategic lawsuits against public participation, which aim to muzzle journalists. I request, where we triggered, this is a technical point, Article 48 of the treaty, in order for us to have a constitutional convention, in order for us to follow up on a very broadly advertised and extremely well processed, or at least the conclusions were extremely clear, of our conference on the future of Europe, which we hope to continue to form part of our discussions. Common energy union. After the war, we woke up to the realization that, one, we were extremely dependent on an unreliable partner, if I can call it that. Two, that we did not rely on our neighbors for energy. Three, that we were far away from our targets on renewables. And four, that our citizens wanted us to take those decisions at the European level because they thought it could only be done at European level. That's why today we have joint procurement. We have joint storage of gas. Shouldn't we have an energy union then in the treaty? Shouldn't we have, since the pandemic, where again citizens look to Europe for solutions, have a health union? These are things that we have put on the table. I think we will make there will be efforts before the end of our mandate. But now I will contradict myself. Because we talk a lot about, for example, how we need to revise our decision-making, right? What works with majorities, what doesn't work with unanimity, etc. For many years, we could have had majority position on migration, but we didn't do it. Because we lacked the political courage and will. So let's not also think that reform by itself, without political will, can be conducive to having a better either legislative framework or a system that works. Today we are in a situation where there are more internal borders introduced than internal borders that are not introduced, pushing back against the narrative of free movement. Understandably so, we are living in a very difficult period. But to keep in mind that we worked hard to make sure that we have freedom of movement in the European Union, and that this is why we say that such reintroduction of border checks should be temporary and limited in their nature. So all of this, and hence the contradiction in a way, is that we do not need reform or treaty change to make sure that this doesn't happen or that this happens rarely. We only need political will and courage.
Thank you very much for your revealing answer. There's a question over here, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very inspiring speech. I have one question. You talked a lot about foreign relations and about our relation as Europe to other countries that are outside of Europe. But also inside of Europe, we now have particularly one government that is also against a lot of the things you talked about that unites us. How do we talk to them? How do we reconcile us in Europe and without excluding those members, those partners inside of Europe? Thank you so very much.
Thanks for this. You know, if I had given this speech in 2016, I would have expressed concern about a European Union and countries within it that are increasingly looking for an exit. We don't say that anymore. And the reason is because we have realized that perhaps it's not such a good idea after all. From whichever way you look at it, whether you were on one side or another in those years. You even have parties that are on the extremes of the political spectrum that no longer talk about exit of their country or being anti-Euro or anti-Europe in general. That's also something, you know, politically we need to digest in terms of whether there are elections on a local level, national, but also European in terms of the majorities that will need to be construed next year. And it is those majorities that will rely on members that are elected from the countries of the European Union and what for them Europe should look like for the next 5 years. This will be the campaign that we run. What is Europe for us? I come from the school of thought that I would rather not spend my time naming and shaming countries. Why? We spent a lot of time doing that, and if we lose populations rather than keep on believing in the ability of those populations to be as pro-European as possible, then we lose them. We have seen that in some countries, especially when you come from a country that is a newer member of the European Union, for whom the collapse of communism is not so far away. On the other hand, I would say, and this is also thanks to the European Parliament that we pushed for, is that rule of law, which is in Article 2 of the treaty, is respected everywhere. And what we make new members or incoming members do is nothing is so much more when compared to the ability for a member country once in to do what it likes. So when we also talk about reform and institutional beefing up of keeping everybody in check, that in other words, where the media is thwarted in one country, then the other countries can explicitly have tools to disagree with and make that country change course. That when a country declares LGBTI-free zones, then that is declared not possible. At the end of the day, especially with this last part, you have to help democracy working in those countries. In other words, making sure that elections are free and fair, not full of misinformation. And most of the time, those on the right side of history win. We have to hope for that.
Thank you for this optimistic reply. No,
I'm not sure it was very optimistic.
I share your optimism in a sense. There was a gentleman. The same question you without
exactly
even
the same.
talking
That's
to
great.
each other. Further questions? Yes, there's. Please, your question, lady on the left side, and then it's a bit further.
Thank you so much for your speech. I have a question. What's your opinion on a deeper European integration, as it may not be possible for the whole European Union, as some states want to keep their sovereignty? What is your opinion on models of a deeper integration for only some states?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, not easy. In a way, there is already deeper integration in some states. Some is legally possible in the treaties, the so-called enhanced cooperation mechanism, which we did. I will tell you. Sorry, I'm a lawyer, so I will give you some legal memories. But there was a moment when some parts of family law were not the same in all countries, so others went forward and left those that did not want to join behind. A patent court, for example. Today we have the European Public Prosecutor's Office, whereby not all member states have joined, although we hear that Poland will join if we will have to see what happens in the next few weeks. So in a way that is already the case, and I would also tell you that in foreign policy, so if you think about the way the European Peace Facility works, if that's integrated into the treaty, we have seen that some countries can go further in terms of defense cooperation, and not at the cost of neutral countries losing their neutrality because they are constitutionally neutral. Should we go further? For me, and Ursula von der Leyen said this in her State of the Union speech, deepening should not come at the cost of widening and not vice versa. In other words, we can grow and we cannot be afraid of further integration where needed. That's where the word subsidiarity comes back. I sometimes find myself in a situation where it's difficult to explain to citizens why we are regulating an area, because it's disproportionately difficult for them to implement it, while at the same time we have financial services sector who are asking us to legislate on AI. We have the Green Deal, which I mentioned in my speech, with some parts of the society saying, yes, please, you need to legislate more, and other parts who say, wait, please, a little bit. We are under a huge economic impact since still feeling it from the pandemic. Others saying, actually, this is my possibility for me to go faster on my green transition. So it's very specific in different countries, but I think we deserve to have that conversation. Where have we gone too far? Where can we still go further? Because we're living a little bit in crisis mode, we don't talk about this enough. And we miss this. The President of the European Council, Charles Michel, is planning to start to organize smaller groups of prime ministers starting to think about this, and that's good. So I'm looking forward to a level of discussion, especially now since we've had our third meeting of the European political community, which I can tell you, this is my experience. I have been there. I attend these meetings, bringing 50 leaders of these countries, some at different layers of closeness to the European Union, some with open conflicts between each other. But the ability to place those 50 leaders together in one room should not be underestimated. And that can only be done in Europe by us.
Thank you so much. There was a question quite near to, I think it was you, yes.
Thank you very much for your interesting speech, Madam President. My question focuses on the European elections next year. And I want to ask about the Spitzenkandidaten system. As you know, in 2014, it was introduced as a way of empowering citizens, empowering the parliament. But now in the last election, it was not used, and instead it was a decision made by the heads of state. And from a parliamentary perspective, would you argue for the Spitzenkandidaten to return to the Spitzenkandidaten system, or would you, what are your thoughts on this, maybe also as a view from the parliament as an institution? Thank you.
Yes. So first of all, it's one of the German words that almost everybody in the European Union understands. It worked in 2014, as you said. It didn't work in 2019. The European Parliament is firmly in favor of the Spitzenkandidat system, especially, here with the way you organize your elections here, that the so-called head of list, the tête de liste, is one that presents the party program. And that would then translate into the day after the election an understanding of where the majorities are and going with one candidate. That is what we look forward to having next year. We can also, let's say, from an academic perspective, discuss when does the Spitzenkandidat decision take place? One, is it when the individual political groups choose their candidates? Two, is it the day after the European election when you see who is the largest political group and whether that largest political group can bring together the majority? Three, is it when the prime ministers get together and agree on a person to be nominated with a qualified majority in the European Council? Or four, which is when the Parliament votes on the candidate for President of the European Commission? I would argue number four, but with steps that need to be taken, and hopefully with the next year being smoother than it was in 2019. There is nothing that would benefit, I would say, the European Union if the immediate day after of the European elections would be focused on a, let's say, an open disagreement. I would rather say that this is a democratic process, and that democratic process has to be responsibly carried by us. It's that responsibility which will take us forward and will shape how we characterize our next 5 years, which will be, I start to say, harder than the last ones. Last thing for me to say on this is majorities matter. So the European Parliament, on foreign policy and most of the issues that I mentioned in my remarks, you have broad majorities. It's not difficult to have 400, 500, even 600 votes in favor out of 705. On others, it is sometimes 333, 333, 334, 335. That's difficult as a president to manage a vote, but it gives you also an understanding that on some issues the parliament is split right down the middle, left and right. And next year we will have to see whether what we call the constructive pro-European centre remains the only majority that can bring forward those responsible decisions that are taken. That's why it's important that you vote. And whenever I meet people who think that their vote doesn't matter, my answer is, somebody's going to get elected. You might not like what you see. We even have 15 more seats next year for certain countries, so let's see where they go.
So that you're saying that things will be more difficult than the last legislative period, this is the composition of the parliament, because we had a pandemic, the Russians attacking Ukraine.
2 weeks
Hamas.
ago I would have also said the same thing, and look at us today.
Yeah. Okay. We try to be optimistic, but we also have to conserve our realism, and
I think so.
That is true. There's another question over here. Yes, please, the gentleman.
Thank you for your speech. You say that the extremes are concerning, which presumably includes some European parties. Should there be a change in approach concerning them?
Yes, I think, and I speak as somebody who comes from, let's say, a traditional party, right? A party that is used to either being in government or in opposition on a national level. I think the error that has been made by these parties, and I speak in general across the whole of the European Union, is that they have taken their voters for granted, their electorate for granted, thinking that no matter what, these will always vote for me, for us. And two, and this is particularly true for the European elections. This will be my 5th European election in 2024. I first ran in 2004, 20 years ago, is that you ignore populist rhetoric and you do not counter it. Why? Because on each side of the extremes, you have a classic narrative, you know, easy answers to the most difficult of questions. Much easier to do that than sit down at a conversation like this where you have to say, this is the advantage, this is the advantage, this is also the disadvantage, but at the end of the day, you need to take a decision. It's much easier to have a one-liner for every response. I'm not like that, but perhaps what we've done for too long is we thought that that was a narrative that could be contained and even worse, ignored. We can't ignore it. We need to be able to stand up and say we do not agree and we stand for what is right with, and this is difficult for a politician to say, with a perspective that goes beyond your immediate election. Because that's all too easy to say, okay, so my election is in 8 months and therefore I will say this, this and this, and then the next day who knows. That's not a responsibility that I would ever stand for. It's not easy, it's much more difficult, but it is very much my belief that that's how we have to change. How did you call it? The way what we do, the approach, yeah.
Thank you very much. There's still this side of the room asking more questions, but it's up to you to match.
Yeah, there's a
Thank you for allowing a second question. I'm happy to give that to another person if...
It's okay, it's okay.
I was just wondering, because how much of the responsibility of looking beyond the next election is with politicians and how much of it is with citizens? To crudely paraphrase, why should citizens always ask what Europe can do for them, but never ask what they could do for Europe? So, how do you see the balance of responsibility of ensuring a free and open society between politicians and citizens? Thank you.
Communication, openness, not only talking to oneself and self-applauding, and placing, yes, a responsibility on citizens by giving them a choice. I mentioned before, you know, that we took our electorate for granted. In the end, there was no choice. In some countries, you see citizens who tell us, oh, all political parties look the same to me. That's our responsibility. In some countries, you look at the fact that hardly any women get elected. That's our responsibility. But then once we take that responsibility, then citizens, and that's why we have to communicate better and message better, have to feel ready, I would say even excited, to vote. And then they themselves become part of the narrative and the conversation. If not, we have statistics. Next year, 4 countries, including in this one, in some places here, 4 countries will vote at the age 16. That requires a specific responsibility from us. Because for someone who is 16 and who has never voted before, we need to make sure that it does not become too easy never to vote. Because we have huge amounts of generations. When you're 16, 18, then you are 20, 22, 24, you've never voted, you never vote. And then it's too late. So if I think about campaigns I have run and what has worked and what doesn't, the minute you think that people will vote for you no matter what, you've lost. So it's our responsibility more than anything. And then I think the counterbalance comes, I wouldn't say automatically, but should proceed.
Thank you so much. So now there's a question on this side of the room, which I oversaw the last time.
Okay, let's try to rebalance the relation of questions from the left or right side. Madam President, thank you for your speech. I have a political question to you. Do you think it is possible or even desirable that the United Kingdom will rejoin the European Union?
So, you know, it's a specific, I come from a country that is a former colony of the United Kingdom with a specific reply. I was asked the same thing in the margins of the United Nations General Assembly last month. And my answer to that was very clear. I miss the United Kingdom every day. From many perspectives. One, from a legislative perspective. If you think today how much perhaps we would take decisions more quickly on Ukraine, from a defense perspective, security, migration perspective, I see it within the European political community. When the UK is around the table, you think back, exchange of information from our intelligence services. There is a very, you know, there is a huge wealth of knowledge and experience there. Also, our transatlantic relationship, that there would be no difference between the EU, how we deal with the EU and the US, and the UK and the US. From an economic perspective, will there be a subsidy race to the bottom with one of our biggest now competitors? From a tax perspective. On the other hand, that was a democratic decision, one that might be today regrettable, but one that was taken. And therefore, any decision to rejoin, and there is a specific Scotland issue, there is a specific Northern Ireland context, is one that can only and solely be made by them. And once, or if they take the decision, then they start again as any other country wishing to join the European Union. So I didn't give you such a political answer, it was more emotional, but it was a context that is now one that is felt, especially because geopolitically we are in such difficulty. Let me say one more word. The Windsor Framework, so what we have done, and we have a permanent joint parliamentary assembly with the UK, and the Windsor Framework, which was so ably negotiated, is one that can be a model for how you can turn a very painful process into a somewhat agreeable conclusion from a legislative and economic and trade perspective.
Thank you so much. There's one question over here, please. You need a microphone, sir.
There it is. Thank you very much. It's rather personal remarks that I would like to make, which is historical to lead into the future. And when I became an official of the European Commission, there were still only 6 member states. Alors je devrais parler français oder Deutsch, Italiano, but no English. Well, that's a little joke, but it's true. And when I came to Malta, sent by the European Commission, you, Mrs. President, were just a backfish, as we say, a teenager. I worked for the accession of Malta in Malta. And from the time that I was at the European Commission, I have participated in all enlargements. And at the end, the one that I still lived, but then I was already retired, was the enlargement by Malta and 11 others. So I speak of experience. When there were more than 12, I thought it could no more work unless we would change the treaties and make what I initially hated very much, a two-speed Europe or something similar. And should we now really get into the new enlargement, which will certainly last a long time before it becomes effective, but we could not afford to do that with the treaties that we have. I do not go into the details, that is maybe more your task to do that. And what we could never afford to have, that is this shameful Brexit, which was also to some time our fault, not only the British. And we could never again have a candidate like Turkey. So I could speak an hour about that, but thank you very much for this.
Thank you for your personal memories. I can tell you that we didn't know the word Spitzenkandidat, but we knew the name Verheugen at the time. And our country was the first country to hold a referendum as to whether we would join or not. And as a teenager myself, and then this was a long process. And then as a university student, I ran the youth campaign to join, which is basically how I find myself today here. And there was no, for us, there was absolutely no, and I spoke about this with my parents a couple of days ago, actually yesterday, because there was no point at which we thought that this was a bad idea. But at the end, the result of the referendum was 51.3%. And the European Commission was worried then, because they said if this is the case with a country that should not have taken so long and been so divided on this, what will happen in the others? In the end, the result was closest in our country. If you ask today, 20 years later, next year we will celebrate all 10 countries of ours, 20 years membership, whether you voted in favor of the European Union accession, everybody tells you yes. We were right then, and we are right now. And if there's one thing that we can discuss two speeds, I would even say multi-speed. I would say that there are countries, I mean, we go from countries where more renewable energy is produced than reliance on fossil fuels to countries where wood is still being used to heat homes. This is European Union. So level of personal purchase power, individual purchasing power. 2, economic development. 3, crackdown on corruption are all things that all candidate countries and judicial reform need to face. But I see it from the other way, that if we manage to bring those countries up with us, then we are more secure and more prosperous. At the time, there was concern about the size of Poland. There was concern later about the size of Romania. Do we today question whether it was a good idea to enlarge to those countries? No, I don't see it. I don't say it. And I would not see it. I think that we are stronger and more secure, especially if we see how countries in Central and Eastern Europe have taken on the responsibility of the Ukraine war. That there was no hesitation to take in 7 million Ukrainians, 1 million here. And that's a true power of values. And it is those values that can never let us forget where we start. Because you enter with those values and everything else comes later. We have to believe this, because otherwise we would still be 6. You would still be 6 countries and not 27.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Yes, from a member of parliament who takes the occasion to ask somebody.
Yeah. If I may, I also would like to come back to the extremes, to the extreme right, since we are, I think, very much concerned about those, and it's due to migration, to the unsolved issue of migration. So my question to you would be, since you have been also a long-term member of the Committee of Civil Affairs, Justice and Home Affairs, the current migration asylum package, which is on the table, do you think this will be an answer to the people who are asking for a solution, since we hopefully will pass it until the election, so we have something concluded after years of still stand. But I'm asking for an open answer because you have been really an expert on these issues. If we can give really an answer with this package now to our population, because I think that's very, very important because people are looking for it.
Thanks a lot, Hildegard. I mentioned before the lack of political will that we didn't find in 2017-18 for a package that was distinctly different to this one, but still a package that would balance the so-called asylum pillar with the security pillar. One without the other would never find majority in the European Parliament or in the Council. I think that political will is there today. And I would also go as far as to say we have no choice. In 2019, when we got elected, 26 out of 28 countries placed migration at the top of their concerns. The other 2 were UK and Ireland at the time. Brexit was the top of their concern. Today, if you ask, and we see the numbers, it is security and migration and the economy. It depends. We will have to see next June where we are. But I would expect migration to be at the top of their concern still. The package is good on the table. I am optimistic we can find a majority if Italy is on board and Germany is on board. We will need to see whether the position of Poland will change now. I cannot predict that yet. And whether there will need to be specific solutions found for individual countries. To be clear, and this needs to be emphasized, we talk a lot about returns. I mentioned that briefly in my speech is because we see that there is a big loophole. The number of people that are returned after a rejected asylum application is far lower today than it was 5 years ago. So there's something wrong. We cannot have a holistic migration package if returns is not an essential part of it. And labor migration. In other words, while we are recognizing the economic gaps in the labor market that we have, and realize that migration could be a tool for that. At the same time, recognizing our obligation to grant protection to people who have no choice. Speaking to our partners in North Africa. I say the word partners, understanding that in some countries we have interlocutors, in some countries we don't. But realizing that these are countries that do not only want to talk or be talked by us about migration, The reason why we are blocked on returns is because it will not solve the situation we have today. So I'm hoping that this week we will have a slight opening and that we will find the majorities. In the Parliament we will find them. It will require a bit of work, but we will find them. Like we used to find them in the Civil Liberties Committee where I spent 10 years. But we will need to have the Council with us. And that will be my appeal to Prime Ministers on Thursday. Because it is not only perhaps something that is not immediately obvious for people who think, the June election is far away. It's not far away, it's actually tomorrow. And it's not only us who are running an election, but each and every Prime Minister and President around the table who is a party leader and requires a campaign to win their respective election. And they will need to answer on migration too. Will it be a perfect package? No. Will it resolve everything? No. Think about what we have failed to do in terms of integration. Think about what we have still failed to do in terms of secondary movement, returns to point of entry, where the South is disproportionately burdened with this responsibility. But it's a step. And finally, we have movement. Is that optimistic enough? That's my last one.
I tried to share your optimism. I think we have another. And
do I need to go? It has to be the last one.
Last question? Yes, please. I promise.
I'm in the hands of my colleagues, otherwise I could be here all day.
So thank you again also from my side for the inspiring speech. It was a lot on foreign affairs, and I was wondering, the Parliament in recent years has issued a report on shrinking civil spaces and civil spheres around Europe, and now one of the main legislative proposals was by Mr. Lagodinsky on a EU association, which to me seemed rather thrown out harshly by the Commission and stripped down. Where do you see the role of European institutions in civil spaces throughout Europe, and sort of on the smaller scales and not only large-scale operations? Thank you.
Thanks for this. Yeah, Sergei wrote a really good article last week on the ongoing Israel crisis with Hamas. If we don't talk about civil society, nobody else will. Why? Because we have an obligation, one. Because we are directly elected, we are kept on our toes, as we say, and that there is a reality, that there is a space that is shrinking. Intolerance is rising, and misinformation online is the order of the day. You know, I have 4 sons, and the 2 eldest yesterday started disagreeing between each other about something they had seen on the same story on TikTok. And I asked them both to show me what they had seen, only for me to realize that this was not correct. Neither of them was correct, which is good, otherwise I would be in trouble. But I say this because what we used to look at as shrinking a civil society space, in other words, universities, possibility to express your views liberally, constructive criticism, but not intolerance, is now almost impossible because it's all done online. And that's why in the Parliament we have focused on making sure that what is criminalized, and this is sensitive, especially in this country, let me be aware, I'm aware of this, that what is criminalized offline is also criminalized online. How you balance privacy with use of data, and what is borderline criminal. How do you take down terrorist content? How do you push back against simple mistruths? We also have a situation where if you are in a minority today, it is sometimes harder than it was 10 years ago. That worries me. And if we don't have a society that protects all minorities, then we have a problem. But now I have to think as to where this report of Sergei has arrived, but I will have to see as to whether we could have another possibility to include it in our European election campaign. I will speak to him, actually. Thanks for that. I need to go, apparently. These guys are jumping up and down on this, the front row, so, okay. Thank you. Sorry, I have to go.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Madam President, also to share a lot of your time for a discussion. And I always have a little gift to make sure that you will always remember us. It's a collection of Humboldt speeches, and yours someday will be in the next volume. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time.